I'm Dr. Richard Bolzachelli, lecturer in theology for Catholic Studies Academy. Here we are in the midst of the penitential season of Lent in 2020, while the world is embroiled in a global pandemic, a kind of contemporary plague. At times like this, people are inclined to ask whether we could be witnessing the manifestation of the divine wrath coming to bear upon a sinful world. Well, you might be disappointed if that's your question, because I'm not going to attempt to answer that question here. I think it's a good question. I think it's a question we should be willing to ask ourselves. But it's also one of those questions that I can't really answer. Now, I can utter platitudes and paint God as very, very nice and someone who would never want to see anyone, no matter how wicked, suffer. But that's not exactly the picture of God in the Bible. Or I could paint a grim picture and say that every human being, since the fall of man, deserves to suffer in eternal torment. So we should be thankful if we get anything at all. Dying from a plague should seem, we should be totally okay with that, because after all, we all deserve to go to hell. And I'm not going to say that either. Instead, I think it's important if we ask ourselves questions like this. These are natural questions for a believing person to ask. Is it the right question? I mentioned at the start of the video that we're in the midst of the penitential season of Lent. And during the penitential season of Lent, we remember that old Latin adage, memento mori, remember that you will die. We're reminded of of Saint Benedict, who tells his monks, keep death ever before your eyes. That we sort of live toward death. Not to say that death is the definitive answer to life. That wouldn't be a Christian perspective. But instead to say that death is a moment in every human life. We have to face it. We have to be prepared for it. In fact, to see it coming, to have an opportunity of anticipating its arrival, is traditionally understood in Catholicism to be a blessing. I should be prepared for death. And if I'm not, I should get prepared. So, actually, the silver lining on the cloud of a plague is that it reminds us that death comes to us all. Now, statistically, it may be unlikely that very many of us will die. Even if a lot of people in raw numbers die, it's probably not going to be the case that most people die, right? Most of us will probably be fine. But a lot of people are going to die from this plague. All of us are going to die from something. And it's important for us at times when we're reminded of this fact to orient ourselves toward preparing for that eventuality. So as for myself, I might not know the answer to the question of whether the divine wrath comes to bear upon a sinful world in this case. But I can ask myself the question whether I'm where I ought to be with God. Would I be wholly undeserving of punishment? Do I deserve to go to heaven? Am I right with God? Those are important questions for us to ask at this time. They're important questions for us to ask at any time. But during Lent, We're supposed to ask those questions. And when there's a plague during Lent, we'd better ask those questions.